October 1941. I remember the way the morning light slid across the rooftops of Rikitsa, quiet and pale, as if afraid to disturb anything. Frost clung to the wooden fences like thin glass, and the smell of coal from the station drifted over the town in slow, lazy breaths. Children hurried past me with their satchels bouncing against their sides, cheeks red, scarves trailing behind like little banners. Women bent over their buckets at the well, trading the same jokes they had shared for years. Even the mechanics on the square, faces smudged with grease, sleeves rolled to the elbows, laughed as they argued over a stubborn tractor engine that had refused to start since summer. It all felt so ordinary that morning, so impossibly normal, that for a moment I allowed myself to believe the war would continue to pass us by like a dark train heading somewhere else. The kind you hear but never see. But then the postman pressed a sealed envelope into my hands. His breath smoked in the cold air. His eyes shifted everywhere except toward my face. "From Moscow," he muttered and left before I could respond. I stood alone on the platform, fingers numb even through my gloves, staring at the heavy red wax. Inside, just two words waited like a quiet verdict: "Prepare yourselves." The forest rustled behind me, soft and indifferent, and from somewhere down the tracks came the distant cry of a locomotive. Life around me carried on untouched, children laughing, the clatter of tools on metal, the faint bark of a dog. Yet I knew, even before breaking the seal, that something vast and terrible had begun to turn toward us. The war was no longer a distant thunder on the horizon. It was coming here, to our quiet gardens and wooden houses, to the place where I had spent my entire life. And whether we wished it or not, the fate of our country was about to pass through this small, unremarkable town. October carried us into a colder silence, and by then the news from the front came like punches, brief, breathless, impossible to ignore. I heard it first from a railway guard who stepped into my office with snow still melting on his shoulders. He spoke of Vitebsk falling, then Smolensk, and finally Gomel, each name delivered with the dull shock of an axe hitting wood. The Wehrmacht, he said, moved like a machine, a living thing fed by gasoline and steel. Their tanks cut across the land as if the earth itself were surrendering beneath them. And somewhere among those steel columns marched a commander whose name I had not known before: General Klaus Bergmann. I had never seen Bergmann, but I imagined him as the newspapers described: precise, disciplined, a man whose calm expression never changed, whether signing orders or watching cities collapse in smoke. Under his command, the Germans advanced with terrifying speed. It felt as though the entire western horizon was tilting toward us, villages and towns sliding away like roots torn from frozen soil. And behind every story of defeat there was always the same bitter refrain: communication lost, supply depots burned, divisions encircled or shattered. Our own generals, Kiselev among them, were doing what they could. I heard his name murmured in passing by officers visiting the station, a man stubborn enough to stand his ground even as the front dissolved around him. But stubbornness alone could not slow the disaster. Every retreat felt less like a maneuver and more like a desperate act of survival. People in Rikitsa tried to pretend life was the same. Bakers opened their shops, the school bell still rang, the old men still argued on benches about last year's harvest. But every day the map in my head shrank a little more. The enemy no longer seemed like a distant force moving across someone else's fields. They were coming for the capital, straight for the heart. 6 weeks, Berlin promised its soldiers. 6 weeks and Moscow would fall. It was a strange thing, hearing an enemy's prediction repeated in our quiet town as if it were already truth. Some whispered it with dread, others with defiance, but everyone felt the weight of it. For us, losing the capital meant more than losing a city. It meant the unraveling of everything holding our country together. I felt it in the tremor of every arriving train, in the hollow eyes of evacuees passing through the station, in the way people lowered their voices when mentioning the word Moscow, as if saying it too loudly might summon the catastrophe faster. When I walked home through the frost that evening, I realized something simple and terrifying: the war had finally taken notice of us. And we were not ready. Bergmann's plan reached us in fragments. Rumors carried by freight conductors, scraps of intercepted chatter, hurried notes passed between officers who stopped in Rikitsa only long enough to swallow a cup of tea before rushing east. Still, even in pieces, the picture was clear. The Germans wanted a straight road to Moscow, armored wedges slicing highways, aircraft flattening anything that slowed them, infantry pouring through gaps like water through broken stone. They had maps, fuel, confidence. They believed in the mathematics of their advance, in the rhythm of engines and the precision of their timetables. Some even smiled for photographs before the push began. I remember seeing one such photo in a discarded newspaper: 3 soldiers grinning beside a panzer, snowflakes caught like dust on their collars. They looked certain the war was already won. But wars don't obey diagrams. In our town, far from headquarters and staff tables, a single woman broke the shape of that perfect arrow. Anna Orlova, the math teacher whose chalk had once tapped equations onto the blackboard with cheerful rhythm, gathered a handful of factory workers and old hunters. I stood on the riverbank that morning, watching their breath mingle in the cold as they argued in hushed voices. They carried no uniforms, no medals, just sacks of explosives borrowed from the quarry. But Anna's voice was steady. If they cross that bridge, she told us, they will not stop until the Kremlin is in their sights. I never learned precisely how she knew the timing of the advance. Perhaps she had spoken with scouts, or perhaps she had simply understood the logic of Bergman's plan the same way she understood numbers. Either way, at dusk, when the sky turned a deep bruise purple, we heard the blast. A dull, heavy sound that rolled across the riverbank like thunder turned solid. The bridge, our only bridge, folded into the dark water, timbers cracking, smoke rising in slow, twisting ribbons. That night I walked to the ruins. The air stank of wet ash and torn metal. The river, usually so calm, churned with shards of wood drifting like ghostly wreckage. Anna stood beside me, shoulders trembling from exhaustion or fear. I could not tell which. By dawn, German scouts reached the opposite bank. I watched them through my field glasses, silhouettes pacing angrily, pointing at the collapsed span, gesturing back toward the road where tanks waited behind them like restless animals. They had expected to roll across without resistance, to follow the clean lines their commander had drawn. Instead, they found 30 meters of empty air and a single woman's refusal. Later, much later, I heard that Bergman cursed when the report reached him. 24 hours lost. 24 hours in a race he thought he had already won. That morning I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Even the most powerful machine can be thrown off course by the smallest fracture. Blitzkrieg had cracked. And the war, our war, was no longer following anyone's plan. Snow began falling earlier than anyone expected, first as a shy drift across the fields, then as a steady white curtain that swallowed the road east. I remember stepping outside that morning and hearing nothing. No birds, no carts, no distant rumble of engines. Just the sound of snow settling, soft and deceptive, as if the land itself were trying to hide. But the war was already inside that silence. Each new report told the same grim story. Village after village crushed under German steel, our defenses stretched thin and bleeding. Captain Lev Drozdov's detachment passed through Rikitsa around midday, faces gaunt, uniforms stiff with half-frozen mud. I walked with them to the edge of town, listening as Drozdov spoke in a voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "We're ordered to fall back," he said. "Every kilometer we hold buys time. Burn anything they can use." By evening we saw the glow of our own fuel depot rising like a second sunset. The flames licked at the sky, illuminating the snow in trembling orange. I could hear Drozdov's men smashing telegraph poles, scattering radio parts into drifts, burying ammunition crates beneath collapsed sheds. They moved with the grim precision of men who knew that survival required destruction. "We're not leaving them a single wire," one muttered as he kicked apart the remains of a field phone. And then they were gone again, vanishing into the storm like shadows swallowed by the night. The Germans reached Noginsk soon after, expecting a clean sweep. Instead, the streets erupted around them. Every building became a barricade. Every window flashed with rifle fire. I arrived 2 days later with a group of evacuees, and even from the outskirts I heard the roar of artillery echoing between the frozen houses. Smoke rolled through the alleys in thick, choking waves, broken only by the harsh coughing of engines struggling in the cold. The tanks did not move like the tidy formations shown in German newsreels. They slipped, stalled, churned helplessly in the snow-clogged roads until Soviet gunners struck them from side streets. The closer they came to Moscow, the slower they moved. The world that had once seemed to open for them now resisted with every step. Snow deepened, fuel thickened like syrup, wounded men froze before they could be carried to field stations. I saw German stretcher-bearers dragging bodies through drifts, their boots leaving uneven scars in the white crust. Above them the wind screamed between shattered windows, carrying the same bitter truth. Each kilometer cost them more than the last. The distance to the capital shrank, yes, but it shrank over a carpet of the dead. And somewhere in that relentless frost, the last illusions of an easy victory finally died. The nights grew longer, and in those hours between dusk and dawn the war felt closest, pressing its cold breath against our necks. I spent most evenings in the basement of the clinic, helping Nurse Maria Golubieva sort through dwindling supplies. The place always smelled of iodine, damp concrete, and smoke drifting in from the shelling outside. Each explosion above us sent dust drifting from the ceiling, settling across Maria's hands as she wrapped bandages with mechanical calm. Sometimes her fingers trembled, but her face never changed. "If I stop for a moment, I'll break," she whispered to me once. I believed her. On one of those nights a young soldier was brought in, barely more than a boy, chest soaked with blood, eyes half closed. While Maria worked, he fumbled for a scrap of paper, pressing it into my palm. "For my son," he murmured. "Tell him I tried." I promised, though we both knew the letter would never reach its destination. Less than an hour later his breathing faded into the distant rumble of artillery. I folded the note and placed it in my coat pocket, feeling its weight long after his stretcher was carried away. Far from our basement, across the broken front, another man wrote in the freezing dark. Friedrich Hartmann, a name I only learned later, was a German radio operator huddled inside a half-buried hut, the walls lined with icicles that glittered like glass. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his pencil. "We are not losing to men," he wrote in his diary, "but to the cold." I imagined him pausing each time the wind scraped across the roof, listening for footsteps, for engines, for anything that might signal the end of his endurance. Even our enemies were being crushed by the same indifferent winter. Captain Drozdov's messages reached us irregularly, carried by runners with frostbitten cheeks and hollowed eyes. His unit was holding out somewhere east of Noginsk, their rations almost gone, their ammunition counted bullet by bullet. The commander's orders became short, almost poetic in their desperation. "Hold with what you have, even if what you have is only a shovel." It was not bravado. It was resignation sharpened into resolve. Everyone, soldiers, civilians, retreating officers, wandering refugees, faced the same decision as the year approached its end. Resist, even if resistance meant dying in the snow. Or disappear into the whiteness and surrender to the advancing dark. Most chose to stand their ground, not because they believed victory was near, but because there was nowhere left to run, no warmth to escape into, no road untouched by war. Only the frozen earth beneath our boots, and the terrible knowledge that the storm was still gathering strength. The morning of December 5th arrived like the edge of another world, white, blinding, and merciless. I stood near the station with snow whipping across my face, trying to understand the strange shapes moving through the blizzard. At first I thought it was smoke or tricks of the wind, but then the outlines sharpened. Men in heavy fur-lined coats, rifles strapped across their chests, faces hardened by a cold they had known their whole lives. The Siberians had arrived. They marched past us without a word, their boots cracking the frozen earth, their breath rising in steady clouds. In that moment the air itself seemed to shift. These soldiers were not gaunt or exhausted. They carried none of the despair that had settled into our bones. They looked like winter given human form, and for the first time in months I felt a thin, fragile thread of hope pulling at my chest. Far ahead of us, on the approaches to Moscow, the German advance had stalled so completely that even their officers seemed unable to believe it. Tanks sat half-buried in snowdrifts, their engines dead, their crews huddled around small fires. Horses froze in their harnesses. Columns that once moved with perfect rhythm now crawled in broken segments through the storm. When the Siberians struck, they struck like someone blowing out a candle. A sudden, fierce gust of force that turned the German line into a trembling sheet of ice. Reports filtered back through runners and telegraph fragments. Enemy retreating, convoys abandoned, roads jammed with shattered vehicles. I pictured Bergman somewhere in that chaos, staring at maps that no longer made sense, listening to officers whispering about temperatures that killed faster than bullets. For us, the sound of battle shifted from a steady, hopeless drumming to something sharper, explosions echoing farther west each day. Even the sky felt different, the smoke lifting instead of sinking. In the clinic basement Maria paused during her work, head tilted, as if she too sensed the front moving away. "Maybe," she murmured, "we will see spring." By the time I next walked to the riverbank, the horizon had changed. The Germans were gone, leaving behind frozen tracks, burned-out machinery, and the faint smell of fuel still lingering in the air. Moscow had not fallen. 500,000 enemy soldiers were gone to cold, hunger, or retreat. Blitzkrieg, the word that had haunted every conversation, every whispered fear, lay broken in the snow. In the weeks that followed, the world around Rikitsa seemed to breathe again, though every breath still carried the taste of smoke and winter. I walked the road beyond the station one morning and found it littered with remnants of the retreat, discarded helmets half filled with snow, torn maps pressed flat against the ice, boot prints frozen in mid-stride like the ghosts of men who had vanished before their feet touched the ground again. I bent to pick up a German field canteen, its metal dented, initials scratched faintly on the side. Whoever carried it had likely fled into the storm, swallowed by the same cold that had spared none of us. Word spread quickly that this defeat, this sudden collapse of the German momentum, was being called the first great turning point of the war. I heard the phrase whispered by officers at the station, murmured by villagers gathering in the square, even spoken aloud by a weary political commissar who passed through with a frostbitten convoy. The world's largest army had been forced to retreat from the gates of Moscow, and that fact alone felt unreal, as if history had stumbled and the ground was still trembling beneath its feet. When I visited the ruins of the bridge, now frozen into a jagged sculpture of broken beams and black ice, I remembered Anna Orlova's face in the smoky dusk. A month earlier she had lit the fuse that cracked the German advance. Now her name was spoken with quiet pride. Near the riverbank the first stones of a small memorial were already stacked, though the war was far from over. People said the bridge would be rebuilt after victory. They said Anna's photograph would hang in the new school museum. They said children would learn of her act long after we were gone. I hoped they were right. Yet the questions that lingered in those early days of relief were heavier than our celebrations. I often found myself wondering what had truly saved the capital. Was it the Siberians moving like phantoms through the snow, or the stubborn courage of men like Drozdov holding the line until their last cartridges froze in their rifles? Or perhaps it was the winter itself, that merciless ally that cared little for nations or flags. When I asked Maria, she simply shook her head. It was all of them, she said softly. And all of us. She was right, of course. Without that single night when Anna destroyed the bridge, without the sudden frost that shattered engines and bones, without the thousands of nameless people who chose not to run, the story might have ended differently. Moscow might have fallen. The country might have fractured. Our town might have vanished into the long shadow of occupation. Even now, when I cross the river and see the memorial rising slowly against the horizon, I feel the weight of that thought. History, I realized, is not shaped only by generals and grand strategies. Sometimes it turns on a single day, a single act, a single breath taken in the cold before dawn. And though the war continued far beyond our frozen fields, the memory of that moment stayed with me, a fragile proof that even in the darkest winter ordinary people could hold back the night.